So we talked about perfect competition, the first market structure. We know that there are thousands, hundreds, there's lots of firms all selling identical products, meaning you cannot determine the producer just by looking at it. If you look at two apples, you can't tell where they came from just by looking at the product. And so when these perfectly competitive firms are earning a profit, or well, let's go back. So you had the side-by-side graphs. You had the market with supply and demand, and then you had the cost curves with the Mr. Dark curve. And those are price-taking firms that have to accept that market price. So if that one firm is earning a profit, new firms are going to enter into that market trying to steal some of that profit away. Remember, there's low barriers to entry in perfect competition. That, we talked about if you want to sell tomatoes, we'll grow tomatoes, show up at the farmer's market. If you think there's more profit in corn, we'll quit growing tomatoes, grow corn, there you go. You left one market, you entered another. Firms are constantly entering and exiting these markets based on where they think they can earn profit. If the current firm is making a loss, then other firms are going to leave the market, leaving their customer base behind. Those customers will get reabsorbed by the firms that are going to stick it out, and then eventually they're going to break even or even earn a profit later on. And so what we're going to do is transition from what we call long-run equilibrium to short-run, which remember is where the firms actually produce. We talked about long-run being a projection model, and then short-run being where they actually produce because they've got fixed resources. So they're going to transition from long-run equilibrium to the short-run. In the short run, they'll either have a profit or a loss, and then eventually they're going to go back to what we call long-run equilibrium. So, anyways, corn, wheat, you get the point. Agricultural products are easy to use because you can't tell the difference in producers. So, all right, in the long run, firms will enter if there's a profit. Firms will leave if there's Firms will leave if there's a loss, and so all firms are going to break even in the long run, or what we call zero economic profit. Or if we go back, we talked about accounting profit and economic profit, and that zero economic profit equal to normal profit, which meant you were actually making accounting money in the real world. But anyways, this is economics. So long-run equilibrium is extremely efficient. And so there's 2 points. The last thing we're going to talk about in 3.7 is there's 2 points of efficiency. There's the allocative efficient point and the productively efficient point. But in the long run, these perfectly competitive firms are going to be both allocatively and productively efficient.
So can normal profit be seen as like making just enough to keep producing?
Yes. I mean, if they're earning zero economic profit, or what we call a normal profit, then from an economic standpoint, they're just kind of at this really balanced, efficient point until we're told something changes. Remember, this is economic cost takes into account the opportunity cost. What they could have made if they did something else. Now, in the real world, if your business is breaking even, well, you've only got so long to survive because eventually your costs are going to go up at some point. But from an economic standpoint, remember, this is all concept and theory, that if they're earning a zero economic profit, they're fine. That's not a big deal, and it's actually extremely efficient because their revenues are equaling their costs. But anyway, and it'll, hopefully the graphing makes a little bit more sense. But you've got the market or the industry on the left, supply and demand, equilibrium price of $15, equilibrium quantity of 5,000. Remember, that is every producer is represented on that supply curve. Every consumer is represented on that demand curve. We're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of consumers, producers, we don't know. But every consumer and producer in the market is represented by that supply and demand curve. And the different quantities and prices that are willing to demand and supply it. That was unit 2. On the firm, remember, these are price-taking firms, so they have to accept whatever that equilibrium market price is. This is just for one of those businesses represented on that supply curve. So this would be one of maybe thousands of different businesses in this market. The firm on the right is in long-run equilibrium, meaning MR equals MC, that all-important point, is also at the minimum point of the ATC. So we know marginal cost is going to intercept the ATC at its minimum point. That is also the point of MR equals MC. So all 3 of those points are at one place on the graph, meaning that the marginal revenue equaling the marginal cost is also the minimum point of cost for the firm. And so this is what we refer to as zero economic profit because they're not earning a profit, because remember MR equals MC would be above the ATC if they were earning a profit. If they were taking a loss, MR equals MC would be below the ATC curve. But everything's equal right there. And so when we talk about being balanced or super efficient, it's because the firm doesn't really have an incentive to do anything right now. They're not earning a profit. They're not taking a loss. They're just kind of at this super happy, balanced, efficient state until, it gives you some kind of hypothetical, demand changes, supply changes, whatever, and then it's going to affect the firm. But in long run equilibrium, everything is equal at that point.
How do you know how that works? How do you graph that?
Long run.
Like that supply and demand. How can you take that supply and demand curve and then transfer it over to that MC and ATC graph?
It just depends on what.
Where does it give it to you?
Well, it'll tell you what state it wants you to show the firm in. And so, typically the market information they're just going to give you. And then they're going to say, okay, either show a firm earning a profit, show a firm taking a loss, which would be in the short run, because that's where they're actually producing, or it could say, show a firm in long run equilibrium. This would be long run equilibrium. And so this is kind of the starting point. So we're about to go from long run to short run, where they are earning a profit or taking a loss, and then they're going to go back to long run. So your economic profit, remember they're actually making money in the real world, but we don't care about accounting profit, we just care about economics. So marginal cost equals the marginal revenue at the minimum point of the ATC. That is your long run equilibrium. No incentive to enter or leave until it gives you that hypothetical of, demand's going up, supply's going down, whatever, and it's going to affect that firm when the market changes. But total revenue is equal to total cost as well, and so that's why you can't determine profit or loss, because revenue is equal to cost. All right, firm on the left. You see equilibrium price of $15, equilibrium quantity of 5,000. On the right is the firm profit, loss, or equilibrium?
Loss. Profit.
Profit. You know that because MR equals MC is above the ATC. So our revenue, that Mr. Dart, MR equals MC, is above the intersection of the ATC curve. So the firm is currently earning a profit. If the firm is earning a profit, new businesses are going to enter into this market, trying to steal some of that profit away. Well, when new businesses enter in, how is it going to affect the market graph on the left? So if we go back to those 5 shifters of supply and demand, and so if we have yes, very good. Supply is going to shift to the right. So new producers are going to join the market. So we're going to see an increase in supply. That was one of those 5 shifters of supply, was number of producers. It's a direct relationship. So when new businesses join in, it's going to increase the supply because we assume additional producers are going to produce more products. So there's going to be a greater supply of products in the market. So supply curve, red curve, going to shift to the right. When that happens, where's my shift? There we go. All right, so when that happens, obviously it's going to create a new equilibrium in the market because we've got all of these new producers producing these products. It's going to lower the equilibrium price, but it's going to increase the equilibrium quantity in the market. All right, these are price-taking firms. They've got to accept the new lower market price in order to be competitive with these new producers coming in with a cheaper price. So when that happens, the firm has to accept the cheaper price, which is going to put the firm into long-run equilibrium, which has decreased the quantity that the firm is going to produce. Because we've gone from MR equals MC there to MR equals MC there, where our revenue. So we can't afford to produce as many products next. Remember, that concept of marginal revenue and marginal cost is we're going to continue to produce products as long as we can sell it for more than it costs to produce it. If the price we can charge goes down, we reach that threshold of marginal revenue and marginal cost quicker. Because now we're not getting as much revenue, and so the costs are going to catch up to the revenue faster than they did before. And so that's why we're going to produce less products when that price goes down in the market. short run to long run. Questions so far? Okay. All right, so now we've got a new equilibrium price and quantity. We've got a firm and long run equilibrium. All right. Second example. Is the firm profit, loss, or equilibrium?
Profit.
Loss. Yeah. So the first thing you're always going to do, find MR equals MC, where the red line and the black line cross. Draw that line all the way through your graph. Draw that vertical line intersecting everything.
So it's about if the line is above and below, and not if the graph is above and below.
Well, you're just looking at this point relative to where that vertical line intercepts that ATC curve. Because think about it. If at 8 units, what this tells us, what that vertical line tells us is that at 8 units, that's our revenue. That's our cost. So we have a cost higher than our revenues at 8 units. Now, this is still the profit maximizing output, meaning at 8 units, that's where we're going to lose the least amount of money. So, I mean, that's still the most, I guess, opportune production point for the firm, because even though they're not earning a profit, we still refer to it as a profit maximization because they're going to lose the least amount of money in production. Does that make sense?
So why wouldn't they go to the equilibrium point? Like, why wouldn't they go to like 9 or something like that to make it at the equilibrium point?
Well, because if they raise the price that they charge for the product in order to get that MR equals MC up here, then who's going to pay $20 for the product compared to thousands of other producers selling it for $15? And so if they raise the price above that market price, no one's going to pay for it. Because why am I going to pay 20 when I can choose 20 over here for 15? And so that's why they have to keep MR equals MC there, because that's as many as they can produce. They're going to maximize revenue up to that point to where they're not going to exceed their cost per
Okay, I
unit.
guess the right question would be like, how do you know it's 8 then? Because it gives you 8.
Well, because that's the quantity at marginal revenue and marginal cost. That MR equals MC. And so,
okay.
And so, I mean, if it just gives you 8, you just automatically make the assumption that 8 is the profit maximizing output, because that's at the point of MR equals MC.
All right, thank you.
So, because you'll never have to, I mean, they'll always have to give you enough information to answer any question that they give you. But, like, if they just gave you this, you just automatically make that assumption that 8 units is the last unit. Like, if they produce that 9th unit, it's going to cost them more to make it than what they can sell for. It's going to cost more because, look, if we went out here to 9 units and drew a line all the way up, well, at those intersections, that marginal cost of that 9th unit is going to be higher than the marginal revenue of that 9th unit. So it's going to cost more to make it than what you can sell it for. And so 8 is the last point. That's that threshold that we are at least selling it for more than what it costs to make it. Anything past 8 units, you're going to pay more to create it than what you can sell it for. Okay? Hanging in there? Okay. All right. So the firm's taking a loss. All right. The current firm's taking a loss. Other firms are going to leave the market because we assume they're taking a loss too. They're going to take their resources, they're going to go produce something else where they can hopefully earn a profit. So firms are going to leave the market. How is that going to affect the market graph on the left?
Supply to the left.
Good. Supply to the left. Is that what you had? So supply curve's going to shift to the left. We know curves decrease to the left, curves increase to the right, always. So supply curve is going to shift to the left because we got a decrease in producers. Because we assume if there's less businesses producing it, then there's going to be a lessened supply in the market. Market graph on the left. And so when that happens, supply curve is going to shift to the left, which is going to increase the price in the market because there's a lower supply now. And so they can charge a little bit higher price for that lower supply, but there's going to be a decreased quantity because obviously if the supply goes down, there's not going to be as many. So price is going up, quantity is going down in the market. These are price-taking firms. They're going to accept the new higher price because why wouldn't they? And so now it's going to put the firm into long-run equilibrium. The nice thing about this is it just so happens to magically work this way in economic theory that it's always, well, unless they give you some kind of additional information, but if you're going from short run to long run, it's always going to magically end up at this nice, efficient, long run equilibrium. Because they want you to understand the concept of whether producers are entering or exiting the market. And then long run is the super efficient point. And so whatever that curve shift on the left, it's always going to be just conveniently shifted enough to put the firm in the long run equilibrium. Does that help? Okay. Because it just works out that way to illustrate the concept. And so that's the nice thing is when you shift those curves, you're going to shift them just enough to put the firm in the long run equilibrium. Honestly, and when you start graphing it, the easiest thing to do is go ahead and draw this marginal revenue curve over here, Mr. Dark, at the higher price that meets that equilibrium, and then come over and figure out where the equilibrium will be over here, and then draw the curve shift. It's easier to do it backwards because then you can always, because sometimes if you just try to shift this curve on your own, you may not get that horizontal at the exact point where it needs to be. And so you could always draw this one first and then go back and figure out, how to shift that other curve or how to shift that supply curve. To me, that's easier because you're always going to get it right if you graph it backwards. But anyways, teach their own. As long as you get it right, it doesn't matter. All right, long run to long run. There's two types of industries. Constant cost, which is what you are 99% going to see on the test, and then there's increasing cost. I think they've either asked one question about increasing cost, or maybe there was like one FRQ in history where you had to graph an increasing cost. So it's not common. I mean, we're going to look at it, but just know if you had to pick between the two, definitely understand constant cost. But, so we already know that if something affects the industry, it's going to affect the price for the firms, and that in the long run, firms will respond to changes as firms enter and exit the market. So that's everything we just talked about. All right, market on the left, $15, $5,000. The firm is in a long run equilibrium. We know that because M equals MC is at the minimum point of the ATC. They're earning zero economic profit. Our total revenue is equal to our total cost in long run equilibrium. Then it gives us a hypothetical. So demand is going to increase in the market. It says what happens in the short run and how does it return in the long run. So demand's going to increase. So we're about to see the demand curve shift to the right, which is going to create a new equilibrium. So we see the price increase and the quantity increase in the market. It doesn't give us the new quantity in the market. But whatever it is, we know it's greater than 5,000 because that was the starting quantity. We know price and quantity have both increased over here when that demand curve shifted to the right. So new equilibrium point there. These are price-taking firms. So they're going to accept that new price of $20. All right, so now the firm is earning a profit because M equals MC is above the ATC. Great job, firm's earning a profit. What's going to happen in the market if the current firm is earning a profit? Exactly. More firms are going to enter into the market trying to also get some of that profit. It's what we call profit motive, that businesses are going to do whatever they think they can earn a profit. They're going to enter and exit these markets wherever they think they can make money. So if I'm going, hey, that business over there is making money, I can do that same thing. I'm going to go do that and try to steal some of their customers away. So supply is going to increase and create a new equilibrium. So we went from equilibrium there to there. Now we're back to here. So we've returned to the original equilibrium price. Quantity in the market has increased. If you go back to when we did double curve shifts in Unit 2, and we talked about either price or quantity would increase or decrease, and the other would be indeterminate. Does that ring a bell? Here we go. That's all that is. And so when you're going long run, short run, and we're about to go back to long run because that price is going to drop back down. Double curve shift, price or quantity will change. The other will be indeterminate. Typically, when you're dealing with these, though, the quantity is going to change. That price is going to go up and come back down, or go down and come back up, based on, because you're going to have to adjust the price in order to show the profit or the loss in the short run. When you go long run or short run. And so when you're working with these transitions, these markets, long run, short run, long run, You're going to see the price increase or decrease, and then return. The only thing that's going to change is the quantity in the market. And so when we first started, we were back here with 15, 5,000, 15, and 8. We go long run, short run, back to long run. The only thing that has changed is the quantity in the market. Through all that transition, that's the only thing that has changed, is we see an increase in quantity in the market, from long run to short run to long run. Questions? This is AP Economics. This is where it's finally all come back together. So,
Hey, I feel like I'm going to Disney World.
yeah, it's a good time. It's a wild ride. So, I mean, and that's why we took so much time in 1 and 2, because it's all foundational leading up to this point. Is that if you know the concepts and the theories and you can apply them, this is just all those little concepts kind of put together, showing why. Because what's microeconomics? Microeconomics is looking at markets and how different changes affect these individual markets based on consumers and producers. And so that's exactly what we're looking at. You know, how does a change in the market affect an individual firm, and then what are consumers and producers going to do based on these changes, and what's going to happen to supply and demand and prices and quantities in these markets.
So how can you tell if it's long run or short run?
So long run, they're always going to look like this. You're not going to have a profit or a loss. Short run, you will have a profit or a loss. So remember, short run is where businesses actually produce. And so in theory, you're always going to have a profit or a loss in the real world. You're always going to be one or the other. Very rarely are you ever just going to magically break even, and if you do, it's not going to be for very long. And so long run is that projection model, that we're just at this balanced state until something changes. But if there's a profit or there's a loss, you're in the short run. If it's everything's equal and there's no profit or loss, you're in long run equilibrium. So this is a constant cost industry, meaning price stayed the same through the whole cycle. So you go long run, short run, long run, it's always going to return back to that original equilibrium price in a constant cost industry. A lot of it is based on the fact that producers are not competing for resources, that any producer that wants to enter and exit to this market can freely come and go as they want. There's super low barriers to entry. Let's do one more. So market, 15 and 5,000. You've got the firm, long run equilibrium. It says if demand decreases. So we're going to see a decrease in demand. It lowers the price in the market, price taking firms. And so now they're charging a lower price. But when that happens, the firm is taking a loss because the cost is greater than the revenues. So if the current firms are taking a loss, some firms are going to leave the market, which is going to shift the supply curve to the left. So we went from here to here to here for our equilibriums. It goes back up to $15. The only thing that has changed is a decrease in quantity in the market. So the last one we saw an increase in quantity in the market. This was just a decrease in quantity in the market. It's the only thing that's changed. All right, increasing cost industry. And this is the one that I said you're not likely to see, but we'll run through it just so that you've at least had some exposure to it. So what happens is when those new firms, let's say the firms are earning a profit, new firms are going to enter into that market. When they do, there's limited resources, and they're going to have to compete. I don't know that I put this one in your notes. So when these new firms enter into this market, they're going to have to compete for scarce resources in order to produce their products. When they do that, it's going to drive up the cost because they're going to have to essentially bid for these resources to get them because there's not enough. So, market, firms in long run equilibrium, demand increases for the product. For whatever reason, consumers want more of it. Well, when consumers want more of it and it raises that price in the market, we see a nice profit margin. Well, that's going to attract new firms. When those new firms enter in, they're going to have to compete for these scarce resources. And so because of that, supplies, not as many producers are going to enter in because they're not going to be able to access those products. Some producers will. Some producers that want to enter the market can't because of these scarce resources. And so the equilibrium point went from here to here, but now back down to here. And so it doesn't return all the way back down because some producers are excluded. And so it actually shifts the cost per production. And so when the firms that actually get into the market and get a hold of some of those scarce resources, they're going to have to pay a higher price for those resources because they had to compete for them. When that happens and their cost of production increases, it increases the average total cost and the marginal cost of production because each new unit is going to cost a little bit more. So when that happens, it raises the cost of production. Essentially, when the firm goes back into long-run equilibrium, you have a higher market price because every firm's having to pay more to produce because you've got more competition. More competition drives up the prices, but also the cost of production. So when you draw this supply curve that runs through the long-run market supply, which we really don't talk about a lot, but it's going to have an upward sloping curve. So constant cost, we went back to that original equilibrium, and it stayed constant all the way through. This one has an increasing cost as new firms enter into the market. Because of all that, that's why you don't see it a lot. Because it's within the scope of the course, but it's getting real close to that edge of what they really want you to be able to do. Like I said, it has come up on the test before, and they haven't specifically said that it's excluded from the content, but you're not going to see it as much because you have to bring in that concept of competition for resources in the market is going to drive up the individual cost of production and show those shifting cost curves. You're not going to see a lot of shifting cost curves questions on the test. Now, marginal cost and average total cost, maybe. And so, but it's, like I said, I wanted you to see it because it could come up on the test. But statistically, it really hasn't in the past because it kind of goes that next step further. But anyways, if you ever see anything increasing cost industry, all it is that firms are competing for those scarce resources, which drives up the cost of production, which is going to create a higher equilibrium when it returns back to long run. That's a constant cost industry where it stays the same. This is what you're more likely to see because the big takeaway is they want you to understand how these markets are going to change and transition as these producers enter and exit the market. That's the big takeaway they want you to understand. Not necessarily, production cost involved for this. They'll do production costs separately, looking at marginal cost and average total cost. All right, last thing we're going to talk about, and then we'll be done with Unit 3. So, two types of efficiency we've already touched on: productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. These are two separate points within the graph you're going to you need to be able to recognize and point out. So we know MR equals MC is the most important point. That's where the firm is actually going to produce. Productive efficiency is just producing the quantity that's at the minimum point of the ATC. So where that marginal cost and average total cost curve intersect, if you produce that quantity at the lowest average total cost possible, that's productive efficiency because you're producing at the absolute lowest cost. But it's not where you're going to maximize profit unless you're in the long run. And so that's productive. I'm going to show you on a graph too. But allocative efficiency is always an intersection of supply and demand because we'll talk about allocative a lot more when we get to Unit 4. But productive efficiency is at the minimum point of the ATC. Allocative efficiency is an intersection of supply and demand. We talked a little bit about the marginal cost curve above the AVC being the short run supply curve for the firm. Is that ringing bells? We'll look at it again. But we talked about the short run supply curve for the firm. And so we can actually determine the intersection of supply and demand for the firm, which is still an equilibrium point. Like we've got equilibrium in the market with supply and demand cross. We can determine the equilibrium point for the firm, which is where the short run supply curve and the marginal revenue Mr. Dart curve intersect. That would be your allocatively efficient point, which is essentially where society wants them to produce. Because at those points of equilibrium, supply from the producers and demand from the consumers is equal. And so when we talk about allocative efficiency, that's that most efficient point in society where consumers and producers meet, which is why I refer to as allocative efficiency, because as far as allocating the resources to produce the exact number of products that consumers want. Oh, wrong button. So this is just saying, as we move forward, recognize you can't just say efficiency anymore, that there's different points of efficiency. There's allocative and productive moving forward. But this is your profit maximizing output. If you were to produce whatever that quantity is, does it show it? Well, you can see it here. So that's profit maximizing output, Q2, MR equals MC. If you were to produce whatever that quantity is at the minimum point of the ATC, that would be your productively efficient point because you're producing at the absolute lowest minimum cost. But that's where you're going to maximize revenues. Actually, you're going to minimize your loss at that point because the firm's taking a loss. But those are two different points within the graph. And so here, they're going to maximize profit, but they're not productively efficient. There, in the long run, they are productively efficient because they're producing at this minimum cost. And so they're maximizing revenue, or sorry, they're maximizing profit at Q3 because that's where MR equals MC, but they're also maximizing profit at their absolute lowest minimum cost. And so when we talk about this being a super efficient point, because of that. And so let me show it right here. So real quick before we end, we talked about marginal cost above the AVC. This is your short run supply curve for the firm. And we'll come back to that later if we need to, but just trust me on it. Short run supply curve, that's also your demand curve. That's your equilibrium point where supply and demand meet. That's where consumers and producers are equally satisfied with the quantity and the price for that product. And so if that is a point of equilibrium, that would be your allocatively efficient point for the firm. For perfect competition, they are always allocatively efficient because they're always going to produce where MR equals MC. So firms are always allocatively efficient in perfect competition because you're always going to produce where MR equals MC. They're only productively efficient in the long run when they're producing at that point of minimum cost.